People could see a bit, it's all right.
Okay, welcome everybody. Hello. Welcome to the first Craft Futures presentation of this academic year. And on our wish list of people who wanted to invite, Amy Twigger Holroyd was right at the very top. As a maker, Dr. Amy Twigger Holroyd, a maker, researcher, writer, so somebody who does beautiful things with the ways that we think about what practice can do, how that can speak to society, and the way that we consume objects and think of new ways of redesigning existing garments and sustainability. So I'm going to hand over to Amy, and there are some of her examples of her pieces that are just out of a solo exhibition that was in...
It was at Rugby Art Gallery and Museum. Yeah.
So they're just out of that exhibition that are getting passed around, so you can see some examples of her work. Okay, right, over to you, Amy.
Okay, thank you, Jane. Really nice to be here. Thank you for coming. Good turnout. Is this your last week of term? Yes, us too. So well done. 2 more days to go. Okay, so I'm going to talk about my research that was my PhD research and things I've continued doing since then. I'm going to try and talk about all of it. And as you'll see, there's kind of different elements to it. It's easier if I only need to tell you about one bit, to be honest. But I'm going to try and do all of it, so we'll see how I do. Okay, so setting the scene a little bit, I tend to start by describing my practice before I went into kind of academic research, because this is really where the ideas emerged from and where my practice is based. So I studied fashion design and then specialised in knitwear design for my MA, and then launched a knitwear label in 2004. Called Keep and Share, where I was exploring ideas of kind of slow fashion and sustainability through exploring how I could design garments that were would have longevity and encourage people to keep them and want to wear them for a long time, and versatile in their applications, so could maybe be worn by different people or in different ways. So I had a studio in rural Herefordshire. It was operating as a kind of micro enterprise on a very kind of craft scale, direct link between me and my customers. And so I did that full time for 6 years before I started my PhD. So here's one of my garments. Over the years that I was doing that kind of as my main thing, my practice started to evolve, and I suppose that's where the research was a further evolution. So I was designing and making collections of knitwear to sell as finished items for all of that time. But after a few years, I started running hand and machine knitting workshops at the studio where people could come and learn skills. And also a little bit of making hand knitting patterns and kits to sell. And that was kind of recognising, as I was standing there trying to sell people a finished cardigan, they would go, "Oh, this is lovely, have you got the pattern?" Which is slightly frustrating when you've spent blood, sweat and tears creating a collection of things that you want people to buy, and then they want the pattern. At first that's annoying. After a while I realised that actually people's desire to make things themselves really fitted in with my interest in kind of slow fashion and sustainability, and people feeling connected potentially to the things that they might make. And so I tried to think about how I could incorporate supporting that kind of activity within my practice. And then I suppose as an extension of that, I started running participatory making projects in a range of settings, partly because there were the opportunities to do that, and there was money available to do that as another source of income for my business. And so I took my knitting tent to festivals around the country for a number of years. We have one of my former volunteers here. I would rope people in to help me, and that was about both selling work and kind of sharing skills, and kind of creating environments where people could make together And I was always interested in the conversations that people had in those settings. And it was those conversations that kind of initiated my research, really. I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. This is just to show all the stuff that I did between 2004 and 2014. I did a kind of retrospective thing in 2014, looking back at 10 years of my practice. You can't see the detail here, but look at all that stuff that I did. That's a lot of stuff, isn't it? Look at all those points and arrows and connecting things. If you study it, it does make sense. Honestly, it's not just a infographic blur. But there was development going on within my practice, and I was, I suppose, as the practice was evolving, I was thinking about making different things. I was also thinking about making work that wasn't just about creating things to sell to people. At first I found that a satisfying challenge, but then it started to feel like a bit of a restriction. If anybody wants to study that in more detail, it's on my website. And so one of the things that I started doing, and this was in about 2009, was I developed this technique which I call stitch hacking. So, and this technique is employed in some of the pieces that you've been passing around. And so I don't really know why I have this idea, but I had the idea of, couldn't I use the technique that is typically used in knitting to repair a mistake? Couldn't I use that to repair something that didn't need repairing in order to change it to differently to how it originally was? So I cut a stitch and open up a row within a plain piece of knitting, and then by laddering columns and reforming the stitches one by one, I can create a new design. And so this kind of started me off thinking about techniques that were about reworking things that already exist in an interesting way, and how as a designer I could explore those ideas and potentially kind of facilitate other people also having a go at doing those things. That's the kind of stuff that I was starting off with. So it was really, I suppose, that as a starting point, or that was one of the starting points that led into my PhD research, which I did full time while also running my business, somehow between 2010 and 2013 at Birmingham City University. So I have previously put together this diagram, which I hope will kind of summarise the starting points, the process I went through, and the new knowledge that I generated by doing this research. So it'll become clear, hopefully in a moment, the different levels, but we'll just look at the starting points initially. I'm going to have to move because I can't read that on that tiny screen. So the starting points really came from reflections on my own practice, and particularly the conversations that I had with people when I was making with them. So I was running workshops. People, almost exclusively women, were coming to my workshops and talking to me about the things that they'd made, the things that they'd knitted, perhaps also sewed, that they made for themselves, and how they felt about that creative process, frustrations that they potentially had with that process, and how they felt about wearing the things once they'd made them. And what I found was the stories that people were telling me kind of chimed with my own experience of trying to make my own clothes since I was a teenager, which is sometimes it's really satisfying and great, and yes, you are really attached to the thing that you've made and you wear it for a long time. Quite often it's gone a bit wrong and you go, oh, you finish it, then you put it on and go, oh, that's not quite what I was intending, and it gets shoved to the back of the wardrobe and never seen again. And so there was kind of ideas going around in sustainable design circles that if you had a hand in making something, it becomes very emotionally significant. You treasure that item, you will use it forever, and then everything can be more sustainable. I'm exaggerating a bit, but I kind of thought, I don't think these people have ever tried to make anything to wear. I think making things to wear is a particularly challenging area. And so I was a bit dubious about these assumptions about people making their own stuff, creating this automatic emotional connection. That was one thing that kind of got me quite worked up. And I also realised that there was a lack of knowledge more generally about what happens when we wear things that we've made ourselves. In terms of fashion theory assumes that everything's bought, because it dates mainly from the 80s when lots of things were bought. And craft theory is really interested in process, but it kind of almost pretends that nothing is made. It never talks about all of the pots that you end up with if you're into making pots. What do you do with all of those pots? I don't see that discussion in craft theory. So I was kind of thinking, there seems to be a bit of a gap here. I then, at a more kind of practical level, had noted that the reworking of knitted garments was rare. So I started this stitch hacking process where I was reworking existing things and applying my knowledge as a knitter to doing that. I realised that people tend to, reasonably frequently think about reworking a sewn item, so a dress or a jacket or something. But really getting into the stitches of a piece of knitting and reworking them, I didn't see a lot of examples of that going on. And then the sort of middle level to do with design, the conversations I've had with knitters at my workshops and the projects and knitting tent stuff, when people were making and talking about making, was I've noticed that people were expressing a desire to be more creative, and that's in their view of their own practices. So that's not me judging their practices and thinking they weren't very creative. That was people saying to me, I ran a workshop about calculating your own knitting patterns, and I would ask at the beginning of the workshop, why have you come? What is it that you want to do? And one woman memorably said, I want to knit off-piste. And everyone else went, yeah, I want to knit off-piste as well. And I had one woman who took part in the research who said, I just don't like being told what to do. She wanted to decide for herself what she was going to do. And so I was kind of interested in that desire, and particularly in terms of knitting, the pattern as a really good tool for making, but also people, some makers feeling like it sometimes felt restrictive to them. So there's a kind of conceptual theme that was running across these things that was about openness. So I realised I was thinking about, and this clarity was not there at the beginning, just to be clear. I did this after I'd finished my PhD. I want to emphasise that. You can't do this diagram when you're doing it. It's almost like, I don't know, diagrams and things. This only comes afterwards, you tidy it up beautifully. But now I've got it, I can present it to you like this. But there always was a thread of openness. And so I was wanting to open garments physically, cut stitches, mess with it. I wanted to open design because I realised that the knitters I was talking to were saying, I'd like to be more creative, but that's what designers do, isn't it? You have to have gone to art school to do that. And I thought, well, no, but the fact that you have that perception is something that perhaps I'm interested in trying to challenge. And on a much bigger scale, I had this idea about trying to open up the fashion system and feeling that people's trepidation about making and altering things, even people with really good making skills who were feeling trepidation about what colours were allowed to go together, that kind of thing. I felt like there's something weird going on in fashion, that we think that shops have the authority and we know nothing, that I wanted to challenge. So the final bit that's just been added here was a metaphor that I've used all the way through, and it actually is what started off my PhD research, was the metaphor of fashion as a commons, so a shared resource that I think should belong to everybody, but I feel has been enclosed by kind of industrialisation and the professionalisation of manufacture and design of the things that we wear. So the commons kind of helps the idea of openness, because I was relating it to one bit of GCSE history. Thank you, Mr. Ainley. This has come in helpful. A memory of the English commons and the enclosure of those commons being such an unbelievable theft. Felt like a useful kind of parallel that I could draw on for the theft that I felt had taken place in terms of people's ability and inclination to do things themselves. So those are the starting points. I then started to do some stuff, and I suppose the key to this is that I was trying to do some practical stuff and at the same time generate data that would help me to think about some more kind of abstract levels about the opening fashion and things like that. So on a practical level, I developed methods for reknitting, for reworking knitted garments. In terms of the kind of design level, I was thinking about how I could design resources that would help other people to do those reknitting things. So it wasn't about me developing my unique closed off methods, it was about creating methods that could be shared. The difficulty with reknitting is every garment that you're going to work with is slightly different, so you can't have a set pattern. But then that's quite a nice design challenge. How do you design patterns that are kind of open recipes that can be adapted and used in different ways? And also creating opportunities for amateur knitters to design for themselves. And then in terms of kind of generating the data that would help me with those bigger questions, I was really interested in the conversations that take place when we make. And I knew from my workshops that you give some people some knitting needles or a row of knitting machines and the chat will come. They will say really good stuff. And so I knew the conversation that would take place while doing this stuff with some people, and those participants' reflections on what they were doing. So that's kind of the process. I'm now going to talk to you about the practice half of it, so the more like working with some stitches, being kind of here, and then talk about the participants. So that's the people who I worked with that maybe helped with the higher up levels of that. So in terms of practice, going a little bit more into the reknitting stuff. So I'd started off with this stitch hack technique that I'd developed. I felt like that could be expanded. I wanted to, okay, I figured that bit out, but what else could you do? And so I use reknitting as an umbrella term for a range of processes that utilise knitting skills, techniques and knowledge, and can be carried out by individuals to repair and alter existing items of knitwear, whether handmade or mass-produced. And that was really important to me, that it wasn't just some handmade things you could alter, but that we could use our knitting skills to look at anything weft knitted and think about altering it, and kind of applying that to the stuff that's in our wardrobes. So, of course, the important thing to say is this isn't a new thing. I haven't invented anything. If anything, I'm trying to rediscover techniques that we used to know how to do, and that it's only a recent development. They're not part and parcel of kind of domestic knitting practice. So this is an image I really like to use to illustrate this. So it's from a really great book by an amazing Norwegian woman called Anna Moore, who owns what I understand is the last shoddy mill in Norway, where waste garments get taken to be ripped up back into fibre to be recycled. And occasionally she grabs items of knitwear from the jaws of the machine, sometimes half mangled items that catch her eye, that have a particular quality to them. So she's got this beautiful archive of handmade Norwegian knitted items, a really valuable kind of folk archive. And this is just one image from a really great book of stockings, where she reckons that in some cases of these stockings, the leg might be 100 years older than the foot, which I just really like as a kind of, you have students who say they want to do slow fashion, and they're like, I might be able to design a garment that lasts 5 years. Imagine that. So I quite like 100 years as a much vaster kind of space of time to imagine something keeping going. It's obviously the leg of your sock doesn't really wear out, does it? I accessed historical sources, so I was looking for what knowledge had been documented of these kind of techniques in the past. And this was the earliest one that I came across, which is instructions on freshening last season's jersey in 1916. So obviously 1915's jerseys were no longer acceptable. They needed a jaunty sailor collar and cuffs. And this is pretty much the start of jerseys being worn as outerwear, so I'm quite impressed that, right at the beginning of us even wearing knitwear as outerwear garments, we were already thinking about how to rework them. And then, unsurprisingly, there's a lot of stuff from the Second World War, rationing, make do and mend, that kind of thing. a series of books by these two women. They keep alternating their names. I think it must have been a nice author credit arrangement, where you always get a really sorry looking before picture and a very glamorous after picture of the rework thing. So we used to know how to do this stuff. We have collectively forgotten as clothes have become cheaper. Knitting practice has become cemented as something where you go and get the pattern, you get the needles, you get the yarn, you produce the thing, you're pleased with it or not, somebody wears it or not, and then you make another, you move on to the next project. And so I looked at what was being done today. Was I just missing all the people re-knitting using their knitting skills? And when I searched, I tended to find things like this that were reworking existing pieces of knitwear, yes, but in often the kind of way where you chuck something in the washing machine, felt it up a bit, chop it, and almost exclusively make a fun accessory. I have no space in my life for fun accessories. I only want hard-working, serious garments that'll do a good job in my wardrobe. So, fine for people who have a big need for fun accessories. That's not me. So, I partly was working from those historical instructions, but also really this starting point was my own ideas as a designer, thinking about what ideas did I have for if I had an existing garment, what could I do to it in a knitterly way, kind of working with the structure and working with knitting processes. So don't look at the detail here, just think about, I suppose I'm just trying to point out the development that took place between these slightly involved developments of trying to think about different strategies for reworking, what steps those strategies had in common, and kind of refining the relationship between them as I went along. So kind of, I suppose I was trying to generate a spectrum of opportunities for what we could do to existing knitted garments, to come up with new combinations that perhaps I haven't found in any books, and also to address the fact that in today's context, if we're re-knitting things, we would be doing that for very different reasons and to different garments than we would have been doing, say, in the 1940s. So we might be reworking things that don't physically have any deficiency. They haven't got a hole or a stain. Maybe they're just a bit boring, or maybe it's something that you want to inject some new ideas into. So I was trying to kind of bring out all of those opportunities through this in-depth analysis, let's call it. And that kind of culminated at the end of my PhD, or kind of during my PhD, as this. So this is the kind of first finished version, I suppose, of the Reknit spectrum. So the idea is that you start with any piece of knitwear at the top, and then the different paths coming down vertically represent different ways of opening up that item. So either it's nothing's cut, you're just adding on to it, or you're opening up a row horizontally, really thinking about the structure, or all the way, opening a whole row, or cutting it vertically, which in a room of knitters usually leads to a gasp of horror. And the things coming down here are the steps, so realising there's lots of steps in common, so instructions don't have to necessarily give you that information time after time, you can kind of cross-reference. And it leads to a number of different treatments, as I call them, of what you could do to a knitted garment. And the idea is that this is trying to be comprehensive in terms of technical possibilities, but of course every one is endless in terms of its creative applications, because every garment you start with is different, and what anybody might want to do with them is different. There were kind of practical experiments and documentation of those. I was thinking about how to communicate instructions visually rather than in words. So I found when I started working with a group of knitters and I showed these steps, that made sense to them more than if I'd written step one, unravel cups, that kind of thing. And this is one of the pieces that I passed around. So this was a a sampler garment where I tried out 5 of the processes: replace cuff, stitch back, cardigan eyes, very popular treatment. For those who realise that cardigans are far superior to jumpers. Insert pocket and embellish. So it was kind of important, I suppose, to go from it's all very well doing things on a little rectangular sample that behaves itself. When you'll see the light one day. To try to do something on a garment, even on this was quite a well-behaved garment, but you still realise things that you wouldn't necessarily have anticipated, and I wanted to try to do those things before I shared the techniques with a group of knitters, so I was kind of one step ahead in noticing potential problems. And this is, if you haven't seen this piece yet, this is a industrially produced, really quite fine gauge cashmere jumper that I got from a charity shop. Okay, so that's kind of the main bulk of the practice that was part of the PhD research that got me to a certain point. So now I'll talk about the participation element of the research, which was really important. So this was like, really wasn't, there are lots of art and design PhDs, I would say, where it's about someone examining their own practice and their researching, maybe reflecting on what they do and really analysing that. That wasn't what I was doing. I was trying to generate those techniques and that stuff so that in order that I could share it with other people. And it was really the sharing with other people and thinking about how they would respond to it that I was mainly interested in. So I needed some knitters to work with, and an asset was that I already had a kind of a workshop practice. I already ran these workshops where people came to my studio and knitted. So the group of 6 knitters who took part in the research, 4 of them, get this right, 4 of them had already been on a workshop of mine in the past, but only 1 workshop. And so I kind of put together this information, tried to recruit people and sent it to them. One other woman saw the information on my website. She was a previous customer of a finished garment. And 6th one came from a local knitting group, so I went and talked about what I was doing and tried to recruit people. And they were all women who took part. That wasn't a requirement on my part. I just wanted people who had experience of trying to knit things for themselves and kind of had knitting as a regular hobby in their lives, but the participation reflects the gendered nature of knitting participation more broadly. So I've got some really nice slides here of my data. It's just really nice, isn't it, to pull it out. Look at all this, look how much work I did. Oh, it makes you cry looking back. I really love this bit, actually. So this is a transcript of an interview with one of the participants. So I did individual interviews initially, talking to them about talking to each woman about her experiences of fashion, and a little bit about their making, and structured it partly around the wardrobe and kind of the contents of the wardrobe. Asked them to pick 2 frequently worn and 2 rarely worn items of knitwear from their wardrobe and to talk about them. And that's a really good, I found a really good kind of device to start an interview, because you've got something to talk about. You're not saying, can you tell me about your experiences of fashion? You go, don't know. So having something to talk about was really valuable. So I transcribed all of those interviews and analysed them. But the main part of the research, so I went to their homes to do that, but the main part of the research took part at my studio. So this was my Hereford studio. I feel quite nostalgic looking at it now, a few years since I left it. And so this was in a space where I ran my other knitting workshops. It felt to the people coming to take part like a kind of designated creative space. You know, it kind of, I always like going to somebody else's studio, so I think it felt to them like a kind of, you know, a nice place to be. And we had a number of sessions. So we initially had 2 evening sessions, which were a bit, the first one was a bit kind of like a focus group / knitting circle. So we just knitted and kind of talked about experiences of making. The second one was becoming a bit more workshoppy, and we started chopping garments and taking them to bits. And then there was 4 full-day workshops that were spaced apart by a month between each one, and where you can see I like making graphic charts. Basically, I just design graphic things now, infographics. So these were the 4 workshops, and this was my again, retrospective summary of what we were doing. As I was doing it, actually, when I was planning workshop 1, I didn't really know what would happen at any of these. So I only planned each one after the previous one had happened. And it was a bit like, I don't know, we just have to start, I just have to try, and I just have to do one. And so they gradually moved, you maybe get a sense of it from this, from some specific activities where I was sharing like one of the techniques with them, and we would all cry a little bit because my instructions were too complicated and I had too many variables going on, and then we would manage to do it, and kind of trying out those techniques and also some design exercises, through to them starting to work on an item from their own wardrobes, reknitting it, and then kind of developing that project. So it kind of moved from quite structured activities to unstructured chat. There was a lot of unstructured chat, which I had the joy of analysing with 3 different audio recorders and 2 webcams, trying to work out who was where doing the chat. So I actually took out the slide that reminded me how many dozens of hours of audio I transcribed and analysed, but it was many, and led to like 500 pages of transcript or something like that. So this was just, because we were doing it, I wasn't very good at capturing visuals of what we were doing, so that was okay, that wasn't the main thing I was meant to be doing. But this is just a little taste of when I asked them to bring in some inspiration, and because this was about, you know, the knitters were trying out these reknitting techniques, but also getting into designing for themselves. And they were all interested in doing that. I'd say that was the main thing that attracted them. But they all felt kind of trepidation about doing it. And so I gave them some homework of gathering inspiration, and I kind of suggested the kind of places they might get that stuff from. I suppose quite similar to how you might do for kind of first-year design students. And I was unsure of how they would feel about that, and whether they would feel intimidated. Oh my word, they turned up with like big suitcases full of stuff. Oh, I found this and I found this. I've been through the whole house from the attic down to the cellar, and I found these things. And they had an amazing archive of stuff that was like this untapped source of inspiration, that like every bit really had some kind of emotional story to it, or link with a family member. There was amazing stuff in there. So I was glad that I hadn't overwhelmed them, I suppose. So this is the kind of transcript from some of the group sessions, so those workshop sessions, where I had what did I write in my thesis? A flexible approach to transcription. Because I didn't need to write every word of them talking about what they had for tea or whatever. But then there would be like these moments of great value. And so I was noting things down, and then I used a technique which I remember actually using for GCSE history revision. Again, thank you, Mr. Ainley. Where if I had to write it on post-it notes, it would make me not write too much. Because I don't like writing, I'm better at typing. So I was kind of pulling out the important points from this data and synthesizing, going through kind of levels of that. So this was then taking the notes from the post-it notes and putting them together into themes. So I'm only labouring this point to kind of show how much effort the qualitative research of working with that data of the conversations, how much effort that involved, but also what value it produced. And that this is as much a craft as stitch hacking or something. So that was one of the knitters working on one of her projects. And these are the 6 finished projects that they produced. So we tried to not make the before pictures look quite so sorry as in those 1940s books. This one has got the biggest holes in elbows of any garment I've ever seen, still that's not been discarded. but that knitter, Margaret, had originally knitted that one actually, and felt very emotionally connected to it because of the time in her life when she'd made it. She said it had been in the rag bag kind of 6 times, so she always took it back. And so there was this kind of latent intention to rework things, but a lack of knowledge of how you might do it. But I suppose a really key thing that I found is that all of these knitters, who varied in terms of their skill, certainly at the beginning of the project, they all had the tacit knowledge to be able to do this stuff, absolutely, but they didn't realise necessarily that they had that knowledge, and they needed the kind of the structure of the project and the sense of permission that they said that it gave them in order to kind of achieve the things that they did. There was some reworked hem and cuffs, more dramatic kind of reworking, and then a very nice cardigan eyes and insert pocket. And so this is just pointing out, there was I kind of planned the workshops with the idea of, I kind of had an idea of where the data was going to go in terms of the research questions, and then in terms of like the aims of our research and the chapters that they ended up in. So there was a process. And I think the logic of that thinking really relates to the logic of being a knitter, and how my brain works. So a little extra bit that kind of added to that. So I had these really, really in-depth interviews and the stuff from the, that unstructured chat from all these workshops from these 6 knitters that was so valuable. And qualitative research is really about getting the detail from a small number of participants. But I kind of wanted another source of information, and I kind of already had the platform to do that. So the knitting tent that I was taking to festivals and had already done before I started my PhD, people were sitting knitting, and right from the beginning I'd asked people to write little messages on little tags and attach them to the knitting when they'd finished. And so there were already loads of comments about how people felt about making, and sometimes about their experience there, but often harking back to memories of themselves knitting, or people they knew knitting, or things that had been knitted for them. And so I kind of built on that. So one year during my PhD, I gave a more specific prompt that was share your memories, share your feelings about wearing homemade clothes, something along those lines. And so then I transcribed and analysed every one of these over 1,000 tags that had been written over all of the years of the knitting tent kind of activity. And particularly in terms of, so this kind of gathered stuff from a larger range of people, and they supported the stuff that I'd found from the in-depth stuff with the people. So you got what I would call from the romantic to the more realist view of homemade clothes. So I can't know this, but I have a feeling that maybe has Michelle ever tried to make a cardigan? Has she really? Or does she just have a romantic idea about people making things? This one is clearly informed by bitter experience. I'm glad that you laughed. If I ever show that to textile students, there's just silence. It's obviously too close to the bone for them. I've learned to miss that one out for them. But that is my favourite one of all time. Just so many times you want to go back and find out more, but I kind of like it just being that little nugget. So that's a romp through all of that stuff that I did. And all of that participatory stuff, and then the writing up, the analysis and the writing up, all took place within a year. So I only started working with my participants a year before I submitted my thesis. I don't necessarily recommend that approach. But it was because I needed to do the practice stuff of developing the techniques before I felt ready to share them with people. But I suppose what I would say to somebody else is, I had to share them before. I would never feel ready. I had to just try. That was what I realised. So we've come to the end of my neatly retrospective diagram. I can point out the new knowledge that all of this stuff generated, and that's obviously what you're aiming to do in research. So I generated some reknitting resources, some information on reknitting. And that wasn't really like a key aim of this research, but it kind of came out of doing the practice. And so at that time, it was some stuff on my Keep and Share website. That's still there, but I've developed that a bit further, as I'll say briefly at the end. But I suppose the main outputs were to do with the knowledge, the kind of transferable knowledge that could apply not just to reknitting, but to other areas of kind of making and craft and design. So there was knowledge about supporting reworking and how, as designers, we might be able to support reworking, potentially in a range of applications. There was findings which I was able to write about how you open design. So it's kind of thing in design, like open design. I was able to feel like I was contributing somewhat to that by, basing it on my experience of trying to design open resources. What did I find? Ways of supporting amateur design, and reflecting a bit on my change in identity as a designer, having moved from somebody who designed and made finished things and flowed them to people to someone who, I'm half joking, but does often design graphics and instructions and bits of instruction. I don't ever design a finished thing really. I never end up with that garment that's like, that's what I've made. It's more, here are some applications of ideas and here are some bits of instruction. And then at this kind of more like fashion theory kind of level, I definitely generated knowledge on the lived experience of wearing homemade clothes. Knowledge about the impact of, if people were designing and reknitting for themselves, how did that affect their perceptions of the fashion system, and coming up with some hopefully more nuanced thinking about the relationship between people making their own stuff and sustainability, and recognising that no, it is nowhere near as straightforward as I've made something, I'm attached to it, I will treasure it and wear it forever. So that stuff was in my PhD thesis, and then my book came out about 6 months ago, so that was maybe, I've lost track of years, a couple of years after finishing my PhD thesis. I'd kind of produced this book, which is built on the same argument and the same findings, but I extended it and undertook further interviews to cover sewing and mending as well as knitting, and wrote it in a way which is suited to a book rather than a PhD thesis, which is a thesis being intended for kind of your examiners only, and a book that I've written trying to aim it at makers as well as an academic audience. So, to finish off, I wanted to tell you about the stuff that I've done with the reknitting processes since I finished that, the PhD research. So I kind of got them to a certain point that I needed to in order to do the research. Because what I was really interested in was people's responses and experiences of doing the reknitting processes. It wasn't to create a really usable and accessible resource for anybody in the world. But then I felt like I really wanted to do that. I've kind of got these starting points now. I really wanted to find ways of sharing them more widely. So this was my exhibition at Rugby Art Gallery and Museum that was in the summer, and then toured to the knitting and stitching shows in London and Harrogate this autumn. And this is the kind of live action version of the spectrum. So that diagram that you saw earlier on with the garment at the top, here it is in real life, little half-scale garments. And it's been refined in order to make the information kind of more accessible. And the response I got from people was that yes, it did make sense to them. One woman at the show a couple of weeks ago particularly came up and said, as a dyslexic person who can't follow patterns, that makes perfect sense to me. So it was really satisfying feedback. I've got a film which I might put on just at the end if you've got questions, which I worked with a filmmaker who's a colleague at NTU, where we documented 3 of those reknitting processes. That's the spectrum just slightly more visible, and then I'll just very quickly whip through the 12 processes. To give you ideas for what you can do for your jumpers at home. So for each one, I did one of these kind of in progress images to try and communicate, you know, the process and how I got to the finish point. I had a vote thing going on at the 2 knitting and stitching shows, and this was the runaway winner in London. Embellish was the runaway winner in Harrogate, from which I conclude that Northerners are more inherently decorative. And maybe Southerners need a bit more girth. When I've totted up, that was just from looking at, we were voting with little red buttons in little milk bottles. When I've counted up the votes and definitely found the overall winner, I'm going to do a new set of instructions for them, because that is what I managed to do, kind of as part of the exhibition, was not only have the spectrum, but I wanted to produce some kind of open instructions that people could follow. And so these are printed versions that really direct to the online version, where I've done pleasingly non-glamorous instructional YouTube videos. It's about as far away from those glamorous manicured women who show you how to do knitting processes as you can get. And then this was the other part of the exhibition. So again, so that's the St Michael piece that's been passed around. So I had the spectrum that was trying to show off the principles, the film that was showing kind of the process for some of those treatments, and then these pieces are about kind of exploring the ideas in a more playful, open way. Kind of, this is my take on what I can do with them. And so this series is called Cathedral Cardigans, with items of knitwear imitating Gothic cathedrals. I included that. What next? I haven't got time to tell you. You'll just have to imagine. I am doing some stuff next, but I'm a little bit worn out of homemade clothes. So I'm starting work on a new thing, but it's kind of, I suppose, starting to work on a new thing is like a big new project. When you've done such a big piece of work over a lot of years, and milked it for as many publications as I can muster, I'm kind of ready for a new, and I'm brewing new things, but they're not neat enough to go into any kind of diagram, of course, because you can't do that while you're doing it. And that's the end. So thank you. I can let that play.
We've got some time for questions and chat. Would anyone like to start us off?
I'd like to ask a non-fashion question.
Okay.
What's a well-behaved garment? That's not
one that
actually...
doesn't go too weird when you're trying to work with it. So part of when you, I mean, a year ago we moved house into a house that needed a reasonable amount of DIY doing to it. Do you know you're doing a bit of DIY and you think, oh, I understand what I need to do here, and then you start doing it and then the wall crumbles away, and you realise that the task is bigger and different to what you'd anticipated. That's not a well-behaved wall. So a well-behaved garment, I suppose, would be one where you kind of can have a mental picture of what's going to happen when you open it, and it pretty much goes along with that. Some remaking is inherently contingent, as in it always has the capacity to go. It's the workmanship of risk, absolutely. You know, it has a capacity to present unanticipated challenges. So the woman who cardiganized her jumper found that the whole thing was slightly askew, which is a spirality issue, actually, an Edinburgh woolen mill. in kind of production terms. So she'd cut straight up the knit, but then it became a bit skewy.
Okay.
So I'd say it was a slightly well-behaved.
I just like the term. I thought the term was quite well-behaved.
I think we can apply it to a lot of things.
Yeah, we
you
can.
can now walk around saying well-behaved is bad.
Thank you.
Yes.
Great.
So I was at the stitching check a couple of weeks ago with two friends, both of whom are knitters as well. And one of them is very well known for she knits things, she wears it, she loves it, then she rips it out and re-knits it.
Okay.
To the
Horror.
gasps of horror of the rest of us. But what was interesting was that she stood in front of your exhibition and said, "Oh my God, I've never thought about doing this with commercially made products." And I'm just wondering whether the women that you spoke to, do they have this different relationship with their commercial knitwear than their handmade?
It's interesting because that was something that I expected. So the little bit of literature that there was would say that mass-produced kind of shop-bought things are presented to us. What does Stuart Walker say? Presented to us as complete and inviolable objects that we're not meant to mess with. And I agree with that. I think that. But what I found was actually that wasn't the distinction that mattered to them. As soon as I had put the idea in their heads that anything was gain, that was fine. It was like that. Okay, fine. I'll go and look in my wardrobe and see what I can find. The distinction they made was between things they could conceive of reworking things that had a perceived deficiency. So it had to have something. It had to have enough value that you could be asked to do it, and it had to have enough wrong with it that you felt like you would be helping it. And so every one of their garments, even the ones that were structurally sound, was like, I never wear this because it's too boring for me. So there was a perceived deficiency in the relationship between them and the garment. As an exercise in one of the sessions, I brought, like the cashmere little jumper that I worked on, another one, basically just a kind of perfect cashmere jumper, got from a charity shop. And they just had such trouble imagining what they could do to it because it was perfect. And it was like, I'll cock it up. Why would we do anything? This would be better to be used by somebody else, even if I didn't want it. So that was really a really interesting finding. So I think once you've planted the idea in people's heads, they actually seem quite ready to. They were a subversive bunch. They were yeah. I think it was due to that sense of permission, but a deeper feeling that was about not wasting things seemed quite important. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. It's annoying, isn't it? It's just because we buy things that are too soft. You know, we're obsessed with soft things, and those things tend to pill. Yeah, they're bigger problems. Like a hole or something is easier to address. I suppose I've got one of the treatments is copy, so you don't actually change the thing. You produce a duplicate of it. And I've got a jumper which I've meant for years to do a copy of. This is a copy actually of a much loved cardigan that I duplicated it. I do wear the other cardigan. The one that I've been intending to copy is beautiful, like awful acrylic, like sweaty, sparky, you know. So I think what it maybe makes people do is reflect. It has to be a longer term thing that it makes you reflect on when you're looking at something to acquire it in the first place. Would that then be worth reworking? You know, to me, it's kind of a longer term thing. So, no, pilling and bobbling is a bit of a problem. But you could take out, there is one of the processes that's reinvent, that's taking out a section of a garment and putting it as a starting point for something else. So you get the non-bobbliest bit and start from there. Yeah, problematic.
You worked with
problems.
Was your enthusiasm for infographics and other kind of methods that you might not use when you were a practitioner a surprise, or did you always know that were the things you learned at your PhD, you thought, my goodness, I didn't expect to be enjoying, say, transcription or
Well, yes.
Or
yes.
enjoying it.
I hadn't done. No, I did enjoy it. I have to say, I loved it. I love analysing. I love using NVivo. I'm not ashamed to say it. I feel like when I'm analysing, I feel like I'm like swimming around in the data and then finding stories that come out of it. Like I find it addictive, and I really genuinely love it. I hadn't ever done that before. I hadn't transcribed. I hadn't done any of that kind of qualitative analysis. Nothing like that. I did my degree and MA that were very studio based. Diagram thing. I think it must be to do with how I see things. I would always draw. I mean, even those scrappy things when I was starting the spectrum, were drawing on big paper, doing a scrappy version. I think I enjoyed discovering that I could make tiny versions of the same thing. Yeah. So yeah, it's kind of shifting the practice and finding new opportunities and new things to do. But it felt natural. It didn't feel like, oh no, I've got to learn how to do something different. Yeah.
That particular technique and the way that it's worked in those garments, it's really
Yeah. Yeah.
I wondered if you looked at the techniques from not just the pragmatic changes.
Yes. Yeah. So I didn't have time to go into that, but yeah, the very first piece I did that I showed the image of originally said who made this. So I hacked into that first piece, and that was a cardigan that had been found in my great aunt's house. When my dad she had dementia and went into a home. My dad was clearing the house. I'd already made a claim for all of the 50s glass animals that were like the distinctive thing of Auntie Alice's house. My sister got the doll that goes over the toilet roll. Like a house of kitsch, unknowing kitsch, I think. Anyway, and my dad phoned me up and said, Amy, I found a chest of drawers completely full of hand-knitted cardigans, do you want them? And I was like, oh, yes. Thinking, no, because I assumed they'd been knitted by my nana, who specialised in kind of acrylic cardigans that nobody really wanted, so now I had like 30 of them. And there was one odd one out that is different in yarn, technique, design, etc. So it was like, really, who did make this? But then I felt if I was asking, by hacking in who made this, I was asking who made that garment. If I've gone in and reworked it, whose garment is it? Who made it? And then when I started working on the mass-produced pieces, it was kind of drawing out the story, and the information is just the information from the label. So it's just surfacing what's already there that we don't think about. So that's in Michael. One was made in the UK when we used to make things in the UK, and so it's kind of pointing out through an act of great, the lavishing of so much time on something that would have been made in such a mass way, one amongst thousands. So yeah, I'm kind of trying to pull the story out of its original making. Yeah.
Can you join me again in a